The wind howled through the mountain pass as Nancy Cook pressed her back against the cabin door, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the frosted window, she could see the shadowy figures moving closer, their torches casting dancing flames against the snow. Behind her, 6 small faces peered from beneath quilts, their eyes wide with terror. She had promised to protect them, promised to be the mother they desperately needed, even though her own body had failed her in that most fundamental way. Now, as the men outside shouted threats about taking the children back to the orphanage, Nancy realized that sometimes being a mother had nothing to do with giving birth and everything to do with standing your ground when evil came knocking. 3 months earlier, the train's whistle had pierced the autumn air as it pulled into the remote Colorado station. Nancy stepped onto the wooden platform, her single carpet bag clutched in trembling hands, her wedding dress carefully folded inside. The mountain town of Cedar Ridge stretched before her like something from a dream, all weathered buildings and towering pines, with snow already dusting the peaks that surrounded the valley like protective giants. She had traveled nearly 2,000 miles to marry a man she had never met, driven by desperation and the crushing weight of her shameful secret. The marriage broker in Chicago had been clear about the arrangement. Philip Young, a widowed mountain man, needed a wife to help care for his 6 adopted children. Nancy needed a fresh start, somewhere her past could not follow her like a shadow. What she had not told the broker, what she could never tell anyone, was that her first marriage had ended not in widowhood as she claimed, but in bitter divorce when her husband discovered she could never give him the children he craved. The doctor's words still echoed in her mind like a death sentence, spoken with clinical detachment that had cut deeper than any blade. As she stood on that platform, watching the train disappear around the mountain bend, Nancy felt the familiar ache in her chest. She had practiced the lies so many times they almost felt like truth. Widowed young, no children, eager for a new beginning. The deception sat heavy on her conscience. But what choice did she have? No man would want a barren woman, especially not one seeking to help raise children. She smoothed her dark wool skirt and lifted her chin, determined to make this work somehow. Philip Young emerged from the general store like a force of nature, tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that spoke of hard work and a face weathered by mountain winters. His dark hair was streaked with premature silver, and his eyes held a wariness that matched her own. Behind him trailed 6 children of varying ages, from a boy who looked to be about 12 down to a girl who could not have been more than 4. They clustered around him like chicks around a protective rooster, their clothes clean but patched, their faces curious and hopeful. The introductions were awkward, conducted in the dusty street with half the town watching from windows and doorways. Philip's voice was deep and careful as he spoke her name, as if testing how it sounded on his tongue. The children studied her with the intense scrutiny that only children possessed, taking in every detail of her appearance, her manner, her worthiness to join their small family. Nancy felt their evaluation like a physical weight, knowing that her acceptance by them mattered more than any marriage certificate. The oldest boy, Ryan James, stepped forward with the serious demeanor of someone forced to grow up too quickly. His younger siblings ranged behind him like a small army, each one bearing the particular alertness of children who had learned not to trust too easily. There was Susan Harris, perhaps 10 years old, with braided hair and a protective arm around the smallest girl. The middle children, twin boys named Nicholas and Justin, watched her with identical expressions of cautious hope. Betty Hall, maybe 8, clutched a worn rag doll as if it were her most precious possession. The youngest, Sharon Myers, peered at Nancy from behind Philip's leg, her thumb firmly planted in her mouth, despite being old enough to know better. These were not Philip's biological children, Nancy realized with a start. They were orphans, each one bearing the particular wariness of those who had been abandoned before. The knowledge hit her like a physical blow, understanding suddenly why Philip had been so willing to marry a stranger. He was not just seeking a wife, he was seeking a mother for children who had none. The ceremony was brief, conducted by the town's aging preacher in a small church that smelled of pine sap and old hymnal pages. Nancy wore her best dress, a deep blue silk that had been her mother's, while Philip stood beside her in a clean white shirt and dark trousers that had clearly been pressed for the occasion. The children sat in the front pew, their faces solemn as they watched two strangers promise to love and honor each other until death parted them. As the preacher spoke the familiar words, Nancy found herself studying Philip's profile, noting the way his jaw tightened when he spoke his vows, the careful control in his voice. This was a man who had been hurt before, she realized. Someone who approached trust like a wounded animal approaches an outstretched hand. When it came time to kiss the bride, he pressed his lips to hers with the gentle restraint of someone sealing a business agreement rather than celebrating love. The cabin Philip called home sat nestled in a clearing, surrounded by towering pines, with a garden plot and chicken coop that spoke of self-sufficiency. It was larger than Nancy had expected, with 2 bedrooms and a main room dominated by a massive stone fireplace. The children had clearly worked hard to prepare for her arrival. Wildflowers sat in mason jars on the rough-hewn table, and someone had swept the floors until they gleamed. A rocking chair sat beside the fireplace, positioned perfectly for watching over the room's occupants. That first night, as Nancy lay in the bed that Philip had gallantly surrendered to her while he took the main room floor, she listened to the sounds of her new family settling into sleep. The children whispered among themselves in the loft above, their voices carrying the particular cadence of those accustomed to finding comfort in each other. Through the thin walls, she could hear Philip moving restlessly on his makeshift bed, probably wondering what he had gotten himself into by marrying a complete stranger. The days that followed were a careful dance of adjustment and discovery. Nancy threw herself into the domestic tasks that had always come naturally to her, finding solace in the familiar rhythms of cooking and cleaning and mending. The children watched her every move with the intensity of those still deciding whether to trust, testing her patience and consistency with the small rebellions and boundary pushing that children everywhere employed. Susan Harris proved to be the most challenging, her 10-year-old heart still raw from whatever circumstances had brought her to Philip's care. She questioned Nancy's every decision, from the way she prepared breakfast to how she arranged the furniture. The girl's hostility was like armor, Nancy realized, protection against another potential abandonment. Rather than fight against it, Nancy chose to demonstrate her commitment through steady presence and unwavering kindness. The twin boys, Nicholas and Justin, were easier to win over, their 8-year-old hearts still open to the possibility of maternal affection. They followed Nancy around the cabin like devoted puppies, eager to help with any task and quick to chatter about their days exploring the mountain wilderness. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and Nancy found herself laughing more in those first weeks than she had in years. Betty Hall remained cautiously optimistic, her 6-year-old heart ready to love, but still protective of itself. She would approach Nancy with small offerings, a wildflower picked during her wanderings or a drawing made with precious paper and pencil. Each gift was presented with the solemnity of a diplomatic offering, and Nancy received them with the reverence they deserved. Little Sharon Myers was the holdout, clinging to Philip with the desperate intensity of someone who had learned that adults could disappear without warning. She watched Nancy from a safe distance, her thumb perpetually in her mouth, her eyes holding the particular sadness of those who had been disappointed too many times. Nancy's heart ached for the child, recognizing in her the same fear of abandonment that had driven Nancy herself to this remote mountain sanctuary. Philip remained an enigma, polite and helpful, but emotionally distant. He rose before dawn to tend his small herd of cattle and check his trap lines, returning at dusk with game for the table and firewood for the stove. His interactions with the children were gentle but measured, as if he too was afraid of caring too deeply. Nancy began to understand that this household was built on a foundation of mutual need rather than love, all of them refugees from various forms of abandonment. The truth about the children's origins came out gradually, revealed in fragments during quiet evening conversations and overheard whispers. Ryan James had been orphaned when his parents died in a cholera outbreak, left to care for his younger sister until the authorities separated them. Susan Harris had been abandoned at a church when her mother could no longer feed her. The twins had been found living on the streets after their father drank himself to death, and their mother simply disappeared one night. Betty Hall's parents had died in a mining accident, leaving her in the care of relatives who saw her as nothing more than an unwanted burden. Sharon Myers had been left at the orphanage as a baby, with nothing but a note pinned to her blanket giving her name. Each story was a testament to the casual cruelty that life could inflict on the innocent, and Nancy felt her heart breaking and mending simultaneously as she absorbed their pain. Philip had found them at the Territorial Orphanage in Denver, a grim institution where children were warehoused like unwanted inventory. He had gone there seeking to adopt one child, perhaps a boy old enough to help with the ranch work. Instead, he had encountered 6 souls who had formed their own family unit within the institutional walls, clinging to each other with the fierce loyalty of survivors. The orphanage director had been only too happy to release all 6 to Philip's care, reducing their burden while collecting the modest fees he offered. The arrangement had worked for 2 years, with Philip providing shelter and sustenance, while the older children helped care for the younger ones. But as the children grew and their needs became more complex, Philip realized they needed something he could not provide. They needed a mother's touch, a woman's understanding, the particular kind of nurturing that came naturally to the feminine heart. Hence his advertisement for a mail-order bride, seeking someone willing to take on the challenge of an instant family. Nancy threw herself into her new role with the desperation of someone who had found their life's purpose. She taught the girls to sew and cook, helped the boys with their letters and numbers, and slowly began to earn their trust through consistent presence and unconditional acceptance. The work was exhausting but deeply fulfilling, filling the empty spaces in her heart that she had thought would remain forever hollow. The first real test came when little Sharon fell ill with a fever that spiked dangerously high. Nancy spent 3 days and nights at the child's bedside, cooling her burning skin with damp claws and spooning water between her cracked lips. Philip hovered nearby, his face etched with worry, while the other children took turns sitting vigil. When Sharon's fever finally broke and she opened her eyes to whisper Nancy's name, the woman felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. That night, as Sharon slept peacefully for the first time in days, Philip found Nancy sitting by the dying fire. His face was haggard with exhaustion and relief, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. He thanked her for caring for Sharon as if she were her own child, and Nancy felt tears spring to her eyes at the unintended irony of his words. If only he knew how desperately she wished these children could be her own in every sense of the word. The seasons turned, and Nancy found her place in the rhythm of mountain life. She learned to preserve food for the harsh winters, to tend the sick animals, to read the signs that warned of coming storms. The children began to call her Mama Nancy, the title bestowed gradually and naturally as her place in their hearts became secure. Each time she heard it, Nancy felt a fierce joy tempered by the knowledge of her deception. Philip began to thaw as well, his conversations with Nancy growing longer and more personal as the months passed. He told her about his first wife, a delicate woman who had died in childbirth along with their unborn son. The loss had devastated him, leaving him convinced that love was too dangerous to risk again. His marriage to Nancy was meant to be practical, safe, a partnership based on mutual benefit, rather than the treacherous territory of the heart. But Nancy was beginning to realize that safety was an illusion, that love crept in regardless of one's intentions. She found herself watching for Philip's return each evening, listening for his step on the porch, feeling her pulse quicken when he smiled at something one of the children said. The knowledge that their marriage was built on her lies sat like a stone in her stomach, growing heavier with each passing day. The crisis came with the first heavy snows of winter, when a delegation from the territorial government arrived at their door. The lead official was a thin, officious man named Kyle Hernandez, who looked at the children as if they were livestock to be inventoried. He carried papers that challenged Philip's right to keep the children, claiming that proper procedures had not been followed in their adoption. The real truth emerged slowly, revealed through Kyle Hernandez's cold recitation of bureaucratic failures. The orphanage director who had released the children to Philip had been operating without proper authority, pocketing the fees for his own benefit rather than following territorial guidelines. The man had since disappeared, leaving behind a trail of questionable transactions and illegal placements. Now the government wanted to correct these oversights by returning all improperly placed children to authorized institutions. Nancy watched Philip's face grow pale as the implications became clear. The children would be separated, sent to different facilities based on age and gender. Siblings would be torn apart. The family bonds they had forged would be severed by bureaucratic efficiency. Ryan James, now nearly 13, would likely be sent to a work farm where his labor could offset the cost of his care. Little Sharon might never see her chosen siblings again. The official gave them 2 weeks to prepare for the children's removal, speaking as if he were discussing the relocation of furniture rather than the destruction of a family. He seemed genuinely puzzled by their distress, unable to understand why anyone would object to proper procedures being followed. As his wagon disappeared down the mountain trail, Nancy felt something fierce and protective rise within her chest. That night, as the children huddled together in their loft, whispering fears and tears, Nancy and Philip sat by the fire discussing their options. The legal channels seemed hopeless, tangled in bureaucratic red tape that could take months to navigate. By then, the children would be scattered across the territory, lost in a system that saw them as problems to be managed rather than souls to be cherished. Philip's voice was hollow as he spoke of his failures, his inability to protect the children who had trusted him. Nancy watched his broad shoulders shake with suppressed emotion and felt her heart breaking for this man who had opened his home to 6 unwanted souls. In that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. She reached across the space between them and took his work-roughened hand in hers. The words tumbled out before she could stop them, her secrets spilling into the firelit room like water from a broken dam. She told him about her first marriage, about the doctor's pronouncement that her womb would never quicken with life. She spoke of the shame that had driven her from Chicago, the lies she had told to secure this marriage, the desperate need to be needed that had brought her to his door. Philip listened without interruption, his face unreadable in the flickering light. When she finished, Nancy braced herself for his anger, his rejection, his demand that she leave immediately. Instead, he squeezed her hand gently and spoke words that would echo in her heart forever. He told her that biology did not make a mother, that the love she had shown his children was worth more than any bloodline. He said that she had become their answer to prayer, even if neither of them had realized they were praying. The next morning brought a plan born of desperation and determination. If the territorial government would not recognize Philip's claim to the children, then they would have to disappear until legal challenges could be mounted. Philip knew of a remote cabin high in the mountains, a place where trappers sometimes wintered when the snows grew too deep for travel. It would be harsh and dangerous, but it would buy them time. The preparations were made in secret, supplies cached in hidden locations, routes planned through wilderness areas where government agents would never think to look. The children, sensing the gravity of the situation, helped with quiet efficiency that broke Nancy's heart. Even little Sharon contributed, packing her few possessions with the solemn determination of someone who understood that everything familiar was about to change. They left before dawn on a morning when fresh snow covered their tracks within hours. Philip led them through paths that seemed to exist only in his memory, following game trails and creek beds through terrain that grew increasingly wild and remote. Nancy carried Sharon on her back when the little girl's legs grew tired, while the older children took turns helping Betty and supporting each other through the difficult passages. The cabin they reached after 2 days of hard travel was little more than a shelter, one room with a stone fireplace and walls chinked with mud and moss. But it was hidden in a valley so remote that even the wildlife seemed surprised by their presence. Philip immediately set about making improvements, cutting firewood and reinforcing the walls while Nancy organized their meager supplies and tried to create some semblance of home. The winter that followed tested them all in ways they had never imagined. Food was scarce, requiring Philip to range far from the cabin in search of game, while Nancy rationed their supplies with mathematical precision. The children fell into survival routines, gathering firewood and melting snow for water, their childhood games replaced by the serious business of staying alive. But something magical happened in that remote cabin, something that transformed hardship into blessing. Without the distractions of civilization, the artificial family bonds forged by necessity began to deepen into something genuine and unbreakable. Nancy found herself truly becoming the mother she had always longed to be. not through biology, but through the daily choices of love and sacrifice. The children responded to her complete dedication by opening their hearts fully for the first time. Susan Harris began seeking Nancy's advice about the changes happening in her growing body, trusting her with the intimate fears and questions that only a mother could address. The twins included her in their elaborate adventure games, casting her as the queen of their imaginary kingdom. Betty Hall began calling her simply Mama, dropping the Nancy as if it had never existed. Most precious of all, little Sharon finally transferred her fierce attachment from Philip to Nancy, climbing into her lap each evening to hear stories and accept the gentle comfort that only maternal arms could provide. The child's thumb gradually left her mouth as her sense of security grew, replaced by chatter and laughter that filled the small cabin with joy. Philip watched this transformation with wonder and growing love. The practical partnership he had envisioned had become something far deeper and more precious. He began to court Nancy properly, bringing her small gifts from his hunting expeditions, wildflowers preserved in snow, interesting stones that caught his eye. Their conversations by the fire grew intimate and personal, two souls learning to trust after years of protective isolation. The first real test of their hidden sanctuary came in late February, when smoke from other fires began appearing in distant valleys. Government search parties were combing the mountains, following rumors and tips from locals who might have seen their passage. Philip began ranging even farther from the cabin, scouting their pursuers' movements and planning escape routes if discovery seemed imminent. Nancy spent those anxious days preparing the children for the possibility of another flight, teaching them wilderness survival skills and helping them memorize rally points where they could reunite if separated. The older children understood the gravity of their situation, but Nancy worked to shield the younger ones from the full weight of their danger, maintaining routines and normalcy, even as her own heart raced with fear. The confrontation came on a night when the wind howled through the mountain passes like a living thing. Nancy had just finished tucking the children into their shared bed when she heard the sound of approaching horses, their hoofbeats muffled by the snow but unmistakable to ears trained by months of vigilant listening. Philip was away checking trap lines, leaving Nancy alone to face whatever was coming. She pressed her back against the cabin door as torchlight flickered through the trees, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain the children could hear it. Through the single window, she could see at least 6 men dismounting from their horses, their official bearing unmistakable even in the dancing shadows. Kyle Hernandez's voice carried clearly through the wind as he directed his men to surround the cabin, cutting off any possibility of escape. Behind Nancy, 6 small faces peered from beneath their shared quilts, their eyes wide with the particular terror that comes from understanding that safety is an illusion. Susan Harris held the younger children close, her young face set with determination that reminded Nancy of her own resolve. Ryan James crept toward the window, probably planning some desperate attempt to help, but Nancy caught his eye and shook her head firmly. The pounding on the door came with Kyle Hernandez's official voice demanding entry in the name of the territorial government. Nancy's hands shook as she considered her options, knowing that opening the door meant the end of everything they had built together. But refusing entry would only delay the inevitable while possibly resulting in violence that could harm the children. She made her choice with the clarity that comes from absolute desperation. Instead of opening the door, Nancy moved to the window and spoke through the glass, her voice carrying the authority of a woman defending her young. She told Kyle Hernandez that he and his men were trespassing on private property, that they had no legal right to enter without proper warrants. The official's response was predictably bureaucratic, citing territorial authority and proper procedures. But Nancy had learned something during their months in hiding, something that transformed her from a frightened woman into a fierce protector. These children had become hers in every way that mattered, claimed not by biology but by the daily choices of love and sacrifice. No piece of paper could sever the bonds forged through shared hardship and mutual devotion. She would not surrender them without a fight. The standoff continued through the long night, with Kyle Hernandez alternating between threats and promises, trying to convince Nancy to surrender the children voluntarily. His men grew increasingly restless as the wind picked up and the temperature dropped, their torches guttering in the fierce mountain gale. Nancy remained at her post by the window, drawing strength from the quiet presence of the children behind her. Dawn brought Philip's return, his approach silent as a hunting cat until he was close enough to assess the situation. Nancy saw him moving through the trees like a shadow, positioning himself where he could observe without being detected. She knew he was calculating odds and planning strategies, his mind working through possibilities with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to life and death decisions. The confrontation escalated when Kyle Hernandez finally lost patience with negotiation. He ordered his men to break down the door, citing emergency authority and the welfare of the children. Nancy heard the splintering of wood and knew that their sanctuary was about to be violated, their fragile family about to be torn apart by bureaucratic efficiency. But Philip chose that moment to emerge from the forest, his rifle held with casual competence that spoke of absolute familiarity with violence. His voice carried the particular authority of a man on his own land, backed by the moral certainty of someone protecting his family. He informed Kyle Hernandez that he was outnumbered and outgunned, that mountain justice operated by different rules than territorial bureaucracy. The official's response was predictably officious, citing legal authority and proper procedures. But Philip's reply cut through the bureaucratic rhetoric like a blade through silk. He spoke of 6 children who had been abandoned by society, rescued from institutional neglect, and given the love and security that every child deserved. He challenged Kyle Hernandez to explain how tearing apart this family served any legitimate government interest. The debate that followed revealed the true nature of the conflict. Kyle Hernandez represented a system that valued procedure over people, that saw children as problems to be managed rather than souls to be cherished. Philip and Nancy represented something far more fundamental, the basic human drive to protect and nurture the vulnerable. The children themselves became the ultimate arbiters, their quiet dignity and obvious love for their chosen parents speaking louder than any legal argument. Susan Harris surprised everyone by stepping forward, her 10-year-old voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. She spoke directly to Kyle Hernandez, telling him about life in the territorial orphanage, about children who died from neglect, and others who simply disappeared into the system's bureaucratic maze. She described the love and security she had found with Philip and Nancy, the education and opportunities that would be lost if they were separated. The other children followed her lead, each one adding their voice to the chorus of resistance. Ryan James spoke of learning to read and write, skills that would serve him throughout his life. The twins described the wilderness education they were receiving, knowledge that would make them valuable citizens of the territory. Betty Hall showed Kyle Hernandez her carefully tended doll, explaining how Nancy had taught her to mend and care for precious things. Little Sharon Myers provided the most powerful testimony of all, simply by walking to Nancy and raising her arms to be lifted. The gesture was so natural, so completely trusting, that even Kyle Hernandez seemed momentarily affected. Here was a child who had found her mother not through biology, but through the deeper bonds of choice and commitment. Nancy felt something shift inside her as she lifted Sharon into her arms. The shame that had driven her from Chicago, the sense of inadequacy that had haunted her entire adult life, simply evaporated in the face of this child's complete trust. She was a mother, not because her body had created life, but because her heart had chosen to nurture it. The distinction that had once seemed so important now appeared meaningless. Philip moved to stand beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. Together they faced Kyle Hernandez and his men, no longer as desperate fugitives but as parents defending their family. The transformation was visible to everyone present, the way their individual strengths combined into something greater than the sum of their parts. The bureaucrat found himself facing not just 2 adults, but an entire family united in resistance. His legal authority seemed suddenly fragile against their moral certainty, his procedures inadequate to address the reality of love and commitment. The children clustered around Philip and Nancy like chicks around protective parents, their body language speaking eloquently of bonds that no paperwork could sever. Kyle Hernandez made one final attempt to assert his authority, threatening to return with additional men and federal marshals if necessary. But Philip's response revealed the fundamental flaw in the official's position. The territorial government was already struggling to maintain order across vast distances with limited resources. Did they really want to commit significant manpower to destroying a family that was successfully caring for 6 children who would otherwise be a burden on the system? The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but nature itself intervened in the form of a massive storm system moving down from the high peaks. The wind began to howl with renewed fury, and snow started falling so heavily that visibility dropped to mere yards. Kyle Hernandez's men were already suffering from the cold, and the prospect of being trapped in the mountains by weather was clearly terrifying to these men accustomed to civilized comforts. Nancy watched through the window as the officials huddled around their guttering torches, their horses stamping restlessly in the deepening snow. She could see Kyle Hernandez calculating odds and considering options, his bureaucratic mind struggling with variables that could not be controlled through proper procedures. The mountain was teaching him a lesson about forces more powerful than territorial authority. The retreat began gradually, with the officials backing toward their horses, while maintaining the fiction that they were simply postponing rather than abandoning their mission. Kyle Hernandez made promises about returning with proper warrants and additional personnel, but his words lacked conviction. The storm was making decisions for all of them, imposing natural law over human bureaucracy. As the officials disappeared into the swirling snow, Nancy felt Philip's arm encircle her shoulders. The children pressed close around them, their faces bright with the particular joy that comes from surviving a threat together. They had faced down the forces that would separate them and emerged stronger for the experience, their bonds tested and proven unbreakable. The storm that had driven away their pursuers also trapped them in the cabin for nearly a week, but Nancy found herself grateful for the enforced intimacy. Without the threat of discovery hanging over them, they could finally relax into the rhythms of family life. She watched Philip teaching Ryan James to carve wood, saw Susan Harris helping the younger children with their letters, observed the 1,000 small interactions that marked a functional family. During those storm-bound days, Philip finally spoke the words that Nancy had been longing to hear. He told her that he loved her, not as a convenient solution to his domestic needs, but as a woman worthy of devotion in her own right. He said that watching her with the children had taught him the difference between biological parenthood and true motherhood, that her capacity for love far exceeded anything that mere genetics could provide. Nancy's response came through tears of joy and relief, years of shame and inadequacy washing away in the face of his acceptance. She told him that these 6 children had given her life meaning and purpose, that being their mother was the greatest privilege she had ever known. Together they acknowledged that their family had been forged not by accident of birth, but by deliberate choice, making it perhaps even more precious than conventional bonds. When the storm finally passed, they emerged to find a world transformed by snow and silence. The immediate threat had passed, but they all understood that Kyle Hernandez would eventually return with reinforcements and proper legal authority. Their sanctuary in the high mountains was temporary at best, a breathing space rather than a permanent solution. Philip had been thinking during the storm-bound days, and he presented a plan that was both simple and audacious. Rather than wait for the bureaucrats to return, they would take the offensive by traveling to the territorial capital and demanding a proper hearing. Nancy would testify about the children's welfare and progress, while Philip would challenge the legal basis for their removal. They would force the system to justify its actions in open court rather than through bureaucratic fiat. The journey to Denver was an adventure in itself, 6 children and 2 adults traveling through wilderness areas where few families had ever ventured. But Nancy found herself enjoying the challenge, watching the children adapt and grow stronger with each passing day. They were becoming true mountain people, comfortable in the wilderness that had once seemed so threatening. The territorial capital was a shock after months in the mountains, all noise and crowds and bureaucratic bustle. But Nancy was no longer the frightened woman who had fled Chicago in shame. She had been transformed by love and purpose into someone capable of facing any challenge. When they appeared at the territorial offices demanding a hearing, she spoke with the authority of a mother defending her young. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and sometimes heated, but Nancy never wavered in her testimony. She spoke of 6 children who had been abandoned by society and rescued by love, of educational progress and emotional healing that could be measured in smiles and laughter. She challenged the officials to explain how separating this family served any legitimate government interest. Philip proved equally formidable in his testimony, presenting documentation of the children's progress and welfare that put the territorial bureaucracy to shame. He had kept meticulous records of their education, their health, their development into productive citizens. His quiet competence and obvious devotion to the children made a powerful impression on the territorial judges. But it was the children themselves who provided the most compelling testimony. When little Sharon Myers climbed into Nancy's lap during the proceedings, calling her mama with complete naturalness, even the most hardened bureaucrats seemed affected. Here was evidence that could not be disputed or dismissed, the living proof that love transcended legal technicalities. Susan Harris spoke with wisdom beyond her years about the difference between institutional care and family love. Ryan James demonstrated his literacy and mathematical skills, evidence of educational opportunities that would have been impossible in an orphanage setting. The twins and Betty Hall showed their wilderness knowledge and practical skills, abilities that would serve them well as territorial citizens. The turning point came when Kyle Hernandez was forced to admit under questioning that the territorial orphanage system was overcrowded and underfunded. He acknowledged that children in institutional care frequently suffered from neglect and abuse, that educational opportunities were minimal at best. His own testimony undermined the case for removing the children from Philip and Nancy's care. The judges deliberated for what seemed like hours while Nancy and Philip waited with the children in a courthouse anteroom. The uncertainty was almost unbearable, knowing that their entire future hung in the balance of legal deliberation. But Nancy found strength in the quiet confidence of the children, their absolute faith that their chosen parents would find a way to keep the family together. When the decision finally came, it was more comprehensive than Nancy had dared hope. The territorial court not only recognized Philip's right to keep the children, but also formalized the adoption process with proper legal documentation. Nancy was officially recognized as their mother, her name appearing on documents that legitimized what her heart had known for months. The celebration that followed was subdued but deeply meaningful. 6 children and 2 adults acknowledging that they had become a family in the eyes of both law and love. They had faced down bureaucratic authority and emerged victorious, their bonds tested and proven stronger than any external threat. The return journey to their mountain home was triumphant, each mile bringing them closer to the sanctuary they had created together. Nancy found herself looking forward to the simple rhythms of domestic life, to the daily choices of love and sacrifice that define true parenthood. She had discovered that being a mother had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with commitment. As their cabin came into view, nestled in its clearing among the towering pines, Nancy felt a deep sense of homecoming. This was where she belonged, not because fate had brought her here, but because she had chosen to stay and fight for what mattered most. The children raced ahead, eager to reclaim their familiar spaces and routines. That evening, as they sat around their fireplace sharing stories of their adventure, Nancy reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had begun as a woman fleeing shame and inadequacy, seeking only a place to hide from her failures. But she had discovered something far more valuable than refuge. She had found her true calling as a mother and protector. Philip reached for her hand as the children settled into sleep, their voices gradually fading into the peaceful sounds of a family at rest. His touch was gentle but sure, speaking of partnership and mutual respect earned through shared trials. They had both been transformed by their experience, individual survivors becoming something stronger and more complete together. The future stretched before them with all its uncertainties and challenges, but Nancy no longer feared what might come. She had learned that love was not diminished by being chosen rather than biological, that families could be forged through commitment rather than blood. The 6 children sleeping peacefully in their loft were proof that the heart's capacity for love was unlimited. As the fire burned low and the mountain night settled around their cabin, Nancy thought about the woman she had been when she first stepped off that train in Cedar Ridge. That frightened, ashamed person seemed like a stranger now, replaced by someone who had found strength in vulnerability and purpose in service to others. She had sought a new beginning and found instead a complete transformation. The children stirred occasionally in their sleep, small sounds of contentment that filled Nancy's heart with fierce protectiveness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but tonight they were all safe and together, a family united by choice rather than chance. She had finally found her answer, not in the children she could never bear, but in the ones she had chosen to love. Philip squeezed her hand gently, his eyes reflecting the firelight and the deep satisfaction of a man who had found his place in the world. Together they had created something precious and enduring, a sanctuary where abandoned souls could heal and grow. They had proven that the strongest families are often those that choose each other, bound not by blood, but by the unbreakable bonds of love freely given. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pines, carrying the promise of seasons yet to come. But inside their cabin, 6 children slept peacefully under the protection of 2 adults who had learned that being a parent meant far more than biology could ever provide. Nancy Cook had come to the mountains as a mail-order bride, seeking refuge from her shame. But she had discovered instead that love multiplies rather than divides, that the heart's capacity for nurturing knows no limits. In choosing to fight for these 6 orphan souls, she had found not just her purpose, but her true identity as a mother whose love transcended every boundary that society could impose.